My little sister never really became anything, Vanessa said with a laugh as the waiter poured champagne around the table. But she does give great advice about coupons. Everyone chuckled softly except me. I lifted my wine glass and took a slow sip while the lights of downtown Chicago shimmered beyond the rooftop windows of Ashford Prime Steakhouse. The city looked beautiful that night. Cold. Expensive. Untouchable. The kind of skyline people spend their whole lives trying to conquer. Vanessa loved places like this because they made her feel important. The engagement dinner had been her idea from the beginning. A private rooftop room. Imported flowers flown in from California. Gold-trimmed menus with her name printed across the top in elegant script. Vanessa Carter Whitmore. Even seeing it written there felt strange. My older sister had spent her entire life chasing status. First in college. Then in dating. Then through every country club and charity gala she could force her way into. Tonight was supposed to be her victory lap. She sat at the center of the table with her diamond ring tilted perfectly beneath the candlelight, making sure everyone noticed the size of it each time she lifted her hand. Across from her sat Daniel Whitmore, her fiancé. Tall. Polished. Quiet in the way successful men often are when they're still deciding whether they trust the room they're sitting in. He wore a navy suit without a tie, his silver watch resting calmly against the tablecloth while he listened to my family orbit around Vanessa like planets around the sun. My mother dabbed tears from the corners of her eyes twice during appetizers alone. I always knew Vanessa would marry well, she said proudly. She was born for this kind of life. I smiled faintly at my plate. Some things never changed. Growing up, Vanessa had always been the beautiful daughter. The charming daughter. The ambitious one. I was the quiet sister who preferred books over parties and business plans over social climbing. Vanessa used to introduce me to her friends as the backup daughter. She thought it was hilarious. The waiter placed a dry-aged ribeye in front of Daniel, and Vanessa leaned closer to him with a grin. Careful, she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. If Evelyn starts talking investments, she'll probably recommend hiding money inside a mattress. My father laughed harder than he should have. My mother shook her head with that familiar expression of secondhand embarrassment she'd worn toward me for most of my life. I didn't react. That seemed to bother Vanessa more than if I'd argued back. She always wanted a reaction. She needed one. Daniel glanced toward me then. Not with pity exactly. More like confusion. As if something about the picture in front of him didn't fully make sense. I could tell he was studying details now. The fact that the restaurant manager had greeted me by name when I arrived. The way two men near the bar nodded respectfully when they passed our table. The fact that the server had quietly asked me first before opening the reserve bottle of Bordeaux. Small things. Easy things to miss unless you were paying attention. Vanessa noticed none of it. She was too busy performing. Honestly, she continued, laughing softly while adjusting her engagement ring again, Evelyn's the type who disappears into the background at family events. If she vanished tomorrow, half the family probably wouldn't notice for a week. Another wave of uncomfortable laughter moved around the table. I set my wine glass down carefully. That's one advantage of being underestimated, I said calmly. Vanessa smirked. And what advantage is that? Before I could answer, I noticed Daniel lowering his gaze beneath the table for just a second. His fingers moved across the screen of his phone. A few seconds later, the color drained slowly from his face. Daniel stared at his phone for several long seconds without blinking. The noise around the table continued at first. Glasses clinked softly. My mother kept talking about wedding venues in Napa Valley. Vanessa continued describing flower arrangements that cost more than most people paid for rent in a month. But slowly the energy around the table began to shift because Daniel was no longer listening to any of it. His expression had changed completely. It was subtle at first. A slight tightening in his jaw. A crease forming between his eyebrows. Then he looked up at me again, this time differently. Not casually. Not politely. Carefully. Like a man realizing he had walked into the middle of a conversation without understanding what language everyone else had been speaking. Vanessa noticed his silence almost immediately. "Babe," she asked with a nervous laugh. "Why do you look like you just saw a ghost?" Daniel did not answer right away. He kept glancing between me and the screen in his hand as if trying to confirm the information was real. I already knew what he had found. Years ago, an interviewer from Chicago Business Monthly called me the invisible millionaire of the Midwest. I hated the article. I hated the photo they used even more. They photographed me outside one of my distribution centers wearing jeans and an old wool coat while I held a coffee cup with no makeup on. Vanessa had actually sent me the link when it came out, but only to mock the photo. I do not think she ever bothered reading the article itself. Most people do not read carefully when they think they already understand someone. Daniel? Vanessa repeated, sharper this time. He slowly locked his phone and placed it face down on the tablecloth. How long have you owned Carter Global Logistics? He asked quietly. The entire table went silent. Even the waiter standing nearby froze for half a second before stepping away discreetly. Vanessa blinked. What? She laughed awkwardly. What are you talking about? Daniel did not look at her. He kept his eyes on me. Carter Global Logistics, he repeated calmly. The company with warehouses in Illinois, Ohio, and Texas. The one that sold part of its freight division last year. My father frowned in confusion. Evelyn works in shipping, he asked. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. Among other things, I answered. Vanessa let out a short laugh that sounded forced now. Wait. Hold on. This is ridiculous. She turned toward me with narrowed eyes. You own that company? I shrugged slightly. Part of it. Daniel looked almost uncomfortable now. According to this article, your estimated net worth is over $7 million. The words landed heavily on the table. Nobody moved. My mother stared at me as though she had never seen me before in her life. My father actually looked offended, which almost made me smile. Vanessa leaned back slowly in her chair. That cannot be right, she said immediately. There is no way. I remained quiet. Outside the rooftop windows, the Chicago River reflected ribbons of gold light through the dark streets below. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly before disappearing into the city noise. I had spent most of my adult life building businesses people overlooked because they sounded boring. Freight. Storage. Regional transport contracts. Nothing glamorous. Nothing Instagram-worthy. Vanessa chased appearances. I chased ownership. Why would you hide something like that? My mother finally whispered. I looked at her calmly across the candlelight. Nobody ever asked. Daniel sat back in his chair slowly, still staring at me with a completely different expression now. Respect. Curiosity. Maybe even embarrassment for what he had just witnessed. Vanessa, meanwhile, looked furious. Not shocked. Not proud. Furious. Because for the first time in her life, the spotlight at the table had moved away from her. Vanessa recovered first, although barely. She picked up her champagne glass with shaky fingers and forced out a laugh that sounded thin and brittle. Okay, this is getting weird, she said. Since when are you some secret billionaire? I almost smiled at the word billionaire. People always imagined wealth as something loud. Mansions with gates. Sports cars parked in circular driveways. Designer logos splashed across every inch of fabric. Vanessa had spent most of her life trying to look rich while drowning in credit card debt and appearances. Real money usually moved quietly. It sat in office buildings nobody noticed and warehouses people drove past without a second glance. I never said I was a billionaire, I answered calmly. Daniel asked a question. I answered it. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Hold on, he muttered. If all this is true, then why are you still living in that condo downtown? Because I like it, I replied. And because I can walk to my office. My mother stared at me across the candles, her face pale now. Office, she whispered. You mean you really run that company? I nodded once. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. The silence felt strange at first, almost fragile. Then memories began surfacing around the table like objects rising slowly through dark water. I could see it happening in their faces one by one. My father suddenly remembering the year his roofing business nearly collapsed after an audit issue. The anonymous certified check that had arrived just in time to keep him afloat. My mother remembering the expensive private rehab center her sister attended after her stroke. The facility no insurance company would fully cover. Vanessa remembering the down payment that mysteriously appeared when she and her former boyfriend almost lost their condo years ago. Nobody had ever asked where the money came from. They simply accepted it because people rarely question miracles when they benefit from them. Daniel looked at me carefully. "You helped them financially?" he asked quietly. I lifted one shoulder slightly. Families help each other sometimes. Vanessa stared at me in disbelief. "Wait," she said slowly. "The money Dad got after the audit, that was you?" I looked down briefly at my untouched steak before answering. "Your father was under a lot of stress back then." My mother covered her mouth softly with her fingers. Oh my God. The strangest part was not their shock. It was the fact that none of them looked grateful. They looked offended. Almost betrayed. As if my silence itself had somehow embarrassed them. Vanessa leaned forward suddenly, her eyes sharp now. "Why would you hide this from your own family?" she demanded. "Do you know how insane that is?" I met her stare calmly. "I did not hide anything. You all just decided who I was a long time ago." That hit harder than I expected. My father looked away first. Daniel remained completely still beside Vanessa, but his expression had changed again. Earlier, he looked impressed. Now he looked thoughtful. Concerned, even. Like he was re-examining every conversation he had ever had with my sister. Vanessa noticed it too. I could see panic beginning to creep underneath her anger. She reached for his hand quickly. "This is ridiculous," she said with another forced laugh. "She is making this sound dramatic on purpose." Daniel did not squeeze her hand back. Instead, he glanced toward me again. "The article says you started the company from a storage unit on the south side 20 years ago," he said. "You built all of that yourself?" I nodded once. "Mostly." Vanessa rolled her eyes aggressively. "Please. You are acting like she invented Amazon." But nobody laughed this time. Even the air at the table felt different now. The balance had shifted completely. For years Vanessa had controlled every room she entered through confidence alone. Tonight was the first time I had ever seen her losing that control in real time. And deep down, I think she realized something terrifying. Daniel was no longer looking at her like the most impressive person in the room. The waiter returned quietly to refill water glasses, but even he seemed to sense the tension hanging over the table now. Nobody was eating anymore. Expensive steaks sat cooling beneath dim amber lights, while the skyline shimmered outside like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly and leaned back in her chair, her smile gone completely now. "I still do not understand why you acted broke all these years," she said coldly. "Normal people do not hide things like this." I looked at her calmly. "I never acted broke. I just never needed strangers to think I was important." "Family is not strangers," my mother snapped suddenly, sounding more emotional than angry. "We should have known." That almost made me laugh. Should have known. The truth was, they had never wanted to know me. Not really. They wanted simple labels because labels made people comfortable. Vanessa was the successful sister. I was the quiet one. Vanessa was glamorous. I was forgettable. Families do this sometimes. They decide who you are early in life and then spend decades ignoring any evidence that contradicts the story they already prefer. Daniel loosened his grip on his wine glass and glanced toward Vanessa carefully. "You never mentioned any of this," he said. Vanessa immediately stiffened. "Because I did not know," she fired back. "Do you think she tells me anything?" I remained silent. Daniel looked unconvinced. Earlier that evening he had admired Vanessa openly. I could see it in the way he watched her speak, the way he smiled whenever she touched his arm. But now he looked like a man slowly discovering cracks beneath expensive paint. My father rubbed his forehead heavily. $7 million, he muttered under his breath like he still could not process it. "And all this time you were driving that old Lexus." "It runs perfectly fine," I answered. "It has only 30,000 miles on it." Vanessa scoffed loudly. "That is not the point." But it was exactly the point. She still did not understand. She thought wealth was performance. Something you wore. Something you displayed. Something you used to force admiration out of people. She had spent 40 years chasing validation from rooms full of strangers, while I spent those same years building contracts, warehouses, payroll systems, and partnerships that quietly grew larger every year. Different priorities create very different lives. So, what exactly do you even do every day? My mother asked carefully now, as though speaking to someone unfamiliar. I oversee operations, I replied. Mostly transportation logistics now. We handle distribution contracts across several states. My father stared at me. That company has hundreds of employees. I nodded once. About 460 last quarter. Vanessa shook her head sharply. This is insane. You seriously expect us to believe you built all that by yourself while sitting alone in that boring condo every night? Daniel looked at her immediately after she said it. Not angry. Just surprised. Like he was hearing her clearly for the first time. I noticed it because I had spent my whole life noticing small shifts in rooms. It was how I survived business meetings. It was how I survived family dinners too. Vanessa suddenly sounded defensive instead of superior. Mean instead of charming. Desperate instead of confident. And the more she talked, the worse it became. You know what I think, she continued bitterly. I think you enjoyed making everyone feel stupid tonight. I tilted my head slightly. Vanessa, you spent the last hour calling me a nobody in front of your fiancé. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment, almost embarrassed on her behalf. The candles flickered softly between us while the distant sound of traffic floated up from the streets below. Then Daniel asked the question that changed the atmosphere completely. Evelyn, he said carefully, if you are worth that much money, why did you never leave Chicago? I looked out toward the city lights for a moment before answering quietly. Because this city remembers who I was before anybody cared who I became. For a while, nobody spoke after that. The city lights reflected softly across the tableware while distant music drifted up from the restaurant floor below us. The rooftop suddenly felt colder than before. Not physically. Emotionally. Like the illusion everyone had been sitting inside all evening had cracked open right down the middle. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, studying me with the kind of attention people usually reserve for puzzles they cannot solve. You started with one storage unit? He asked eventually. I nodded. On the south side. 23 years ago. By yourself. Mostly. Vanessa let out another irritated laugh. Can we stop acting like she built an empire from scratch? She snapped. People exaggerate things online all the time. Daniel picked up his phone again quietly. The article says your company manages contracts for several national retailers. Vanessa rolled her eyes hard enough to look almost childish. And I am sure half of that is inflated public relations nonsense. I remained calm because anger would have ruined the moment. Silence was always more powerful. It forces people to sit with themselves. Vanessa hated silence because silence gave other people room to think. Actually, Daniel continued carefully, there are interviews here from business journals going back almost 15 years. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. 15 years, he repeated softly. I looked down at the candle flickering beside my plate. The company grew slowly. My mother stared at me with an expression I could not fully read anymore. Shock, certainly. But underneath that was something sadder. Regret. Parents never like realizing they misunderstood one of their children. Especially not for decades. Why did you never bring anyone to family events? She asked quietly. You were always alone. I almost answered immediately, but then stopped myself. The truth deserved honesty. Because every time I succeeded at something, I said calmly, Vanessa found a way to make it sound small. Vanessa sat upright instantly. That is not true. I looked at her for the first time in several minutes. You told people my first warehouse looked like a place people got kidnapped in. It was a joke. You laughed when I bought my condo because it did not have a lake view. Because you could obviously afford better. You once introduced me to your friends as the family member who probably still used coupons. Daniel slowly turned toward her after that. Not dramatically. Just slowly enough to make the silence afterward feel heavy. Vanessa noticed it immediately. Her confidence was beginning to crack now, piece by piece. Oh my God, she muttered. Are you seriously turning him against me over old jokes? I folded my hands lightly together on the table. No, Vanessa. I think your own words are doing that. My father exhaled heavily through his nose. My mother stared down at her untouched salad. Nobody defended Vanessa this time. That seemed to unsettle her more than anything else tonight. People like Vanessa survive through audience support, through nods, through laughter, through social momentum. The moment the room stops validating them, panic begins creeping in. Daniel looked down briefly before speaking again. You know what is strange, he said quietly. Vanessa forced another smile toward him. What? He glanced at me for a second before answering. Evelyn has not insulted anyone once tonight. That landed harder than the money ever did. Vanessa immediately looked wounded. So now I am the villain, she asked sharply. Daniel did not answer right away, which was answer enough. Outside the windows, snow had begun falling lightly over downtown Chicago, soft white flakes drifting through the glow of streetlights far below us. I watched them silently for a moment and remembered all the nights I spent alone in my first office balancing invoices because I could not afford an accountant yet. All the winters loading freight schedules myself because I could not afford extra staff. All the mornings I sat in parking lots drinking gas station coffee before sunrise trying to keep the company alive another month. Nobody at this table knew those stories. They never asked. They only noticed success after a man with Google confirmed it was real. Vanessa reached for her wine glass again, but her hand trembled slightly this time. The confidence she walked into the restaurant with was fading fast beneath the weight of a conversation she could no longer control. Around us, other diners laughed softly beneath warm rooftop lights, while waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of expensive cocktails and steaming plates. It struck me then how strange life could be. A few minutes earlier, my family had looked at me like background noise. Now they looked at me like a stranger who had somehow wandered into their story carrying secrets they were never meant to discover. I still think this whole thing is bizarre, Vanessa muttered. You act like some mysterious businesswoman when you could have just told people the truth. Daniel finally spoke before I could answer. Maybe she did not trust how people would treat her once they knew. Vanessa turned sharply toward him. What is that supposed to mean? He hesitated for a second, and that hesitation said everything. Nothing, he replied quietly. But it was not nothing. We all knew it. My mother suddenly looked emotional again. Evelyn, she said softly, all those years you spent alone working, were you unhappy? I considered the question carefully before answering. No, I said honestly. I was busy. That seemed to confuse her. People often assume solitude means sadness because they cannot imagine peace without constant attention from others. But some of the happiest moments of my life happened quietly. Early mornings inside empty warehouses before staff arrived. Watching trucks leave loading docks just before sunrise. Signing my first six-figure contract alone in a tiny office with stained carpet and broken air conditioning. Nobody applauded those moments. Nobody posted photos online celebrating them. But they mattered to me. Vanessa sighed dramatically. I still cannot believe you let Mom and Dad think you were struggling all these years. I never let them think that, I answered calmly. They decided it because I was not flashy. My father rubbed his jaw slowly. You never wore designer clothes. Never talked about money. Never traveled much. I traveled constantly, I replied. For work. Exactly, Vanessa cut in. For work. Not for enjoyment. Not for status. You never cared about any of the things successful people care about. Daniel looked toward her again after that sentence. I noticed it immediately. So did she. Vanessa, he said carefully, I do not think success means what you think it means. The silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut glass. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. Wow, she whispered. You met my sister 4 times and suddenly you're her defense attorney? Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. I am not defending anyone. I am just listening. That only made her angrier. I could see it building now beneath her polished appearance. The panic. The humiliation. The realization that admiration inside a room can disappear much faster than people think. My father suddenly leaned toward me. Is it true your company handles national contracts? He asked carefully. Some. How many employees did you say you have? Roughly 460. He sat back heavily after hearing that number again. My mother looked near tears now. And all this time, she whispered softly, "You came to every birthday dinner and holiday gathering without saying a word." I gave a small shrug. Nobody seemed interested in hearing about freight logistics over mashed potatoes. Daniel laughed quietly under his breath before stopping himself. It was the first genuine sound of warmth at the table all night. Vanessa noticed it immediately. "This is unbelievable," she snapped. "Everybody is acting like she is some kind of saint now." I looked at her calmly across the candles. "No, Vanessa. They are just realizing I was never the person you told them I was." Outside the rooftop windows, the snow continued falling over Chicago in soft white streaks, while the city glowed beneath us like a million distant signals. For the first time all evening, nobody rushed to reassure Vanessa. Nobody laughed at her comments. Nobody helped her regain control of the room. And I think that frightened her more than my money ever could. The dessert menus arrived, but nobody reached for them. The energy at the table had shifted too far for anyone to pretend this was still a celebration. Vanessa sat stiffly beside Daniel, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of her wine glass, while she stared out toward the snowy skyline with narrowed eyes. I could almost hear her thinking, recalculating, repositioning. People like Vanessa always adapt quickly when status changes inside a room. That was one of her talents. Unfortunately for her, Daniel had already started seeing past the performance. "I just wish you had trusted us enough to tell us," my mother said quietly after a long silence. I looked at her gently. "Mom, when I bought my second warehouse, Vanessa told everyone it looked like a giant metal shoebox." Vanessa immediately threw up her hands. "Oh my God. We were in our 20s. When I landed my first regional contract, you asked me if delivery trucks came with employee discounts at gas stations. It was a joke. When I missed Thanksgiving because I was negotiating an expansion deal in Dallas, you told people I was probably eating frozen dinners alone in a motel room." Vanessa slammed her glass down harder than necessary. "Fine. I get it. I was not supportive enough. Is that what everybody wants to hear?" "Nobody asked for an apology," I said calmly. "I am only answering Mom's question." Daniel stayed very still beside her. He was listening differently now. Not like a fiancé trying to keep peace. Like a man collecting information he wished he had known earlier. My father looked exhausted suddenly. "Older. Why did you never defend yourself?" he asked me quietly. I thought about that for a moment. Because people eventually reveal who they are if you let them talk long enough. Vanessa laughed bitterly. There it is. The mysterious, wise billionaire act. But her voice sounded weaker now. Less convincing. "No," Daniel said quietly before I could answer. "I think she just learned something you never did." Vanessa turned toward him sharply. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" He hesitated briefly before speaking. That confidence and attention are not the same thing as character. The silence afterward felt enormous. Even the soft piano music drifting through the restaurant suddenly seemed too loud. Vanessa stared at him as though he had betrayed her publicly. In a way, maybe he had. Not because he insulted her. Because he stopped protecting the version of her he wanted to believe in. My mother suddenly looked close to tears again. "Evelyn," she whispered softly, "all those years you helped us financially. Why did you never tell us it was you?" I folded my napkin slowly in my lap. "Because I wanted to help you," I answered. "Not purchase gratitude." That hit the table harder than anything else all night. My father lowered his eyes immediately. My mother covered her mouth again. Even Vanessa looked momentarily shaken by that answer. Only for a second, but I noticed it. Daniel noticed too. "The article mentioned anonymous charitable donations," he said carefully. "Children's hospitals. Scholarship funds." I gave a small shrug. Chicago gave me opportunities when I had nothing. It seemed fair to give some back. Vanessa exhaled sharply through her nose. "This is unbelievable. You are turning yourself into some kind of humble hero now." I finally looked directly at her again. "No, Vanessa. You are just hearing the truth without mocking it for the first time." Her face tightened instantly. Around us, the rooftop restaurant continued glowing warmly beneath falling snow, while waiters moved through candlelit aisles carrying silver trays and expensive bottles of wine. Somewhere below us, car horns echoed faintly through downtown streets. Life outside kept moving normally. But at our table, something irreversible had happened tonight. Daniel was no longer imagining a future with Vanessa through admiration alone. Now he was imagining it with understanding. And those are two very different things. By the time coffee arrived at the table, nobody looked relaxed anymore. The excitement that had filled the room at the beginning of the evening was completely gone, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. Awareness. The kind people cannot easily laugh away once it settles in. Vanessa stirred sugar into her espresso aggressively without drinking it while Daniel remained unusually quiet beside her. He had stopped touching her arm. Stopped smiling automatically whenever she spoke. Small things. But small things reveal larger truths when you know how to watch for them. I think everybody is being incredibly unfair to me tonight, Vanessa said finally, breaking the silence again. All because Evelyn suddenly decided to reveal she is secretly rich. I did not reveal anything, I answered calmly. You introduced me as a nobody. Daniel looked me up himself. She exhaled sharply. Because he thought your whole mysterious act was weird. Daniel frowned slightly at that. Actually, he said quietly, I searched because the manager greeted her like an owner, not a customer. Vanessa looked caught off guard for a second. What? Daniel glanced toward me. When we arrived, the manager came out personally to welcome Evelyn. He ignored the rest of us completely. My father blinked. I noticed that too. Vanessa laughed nervously. Okay, so what? Maybe she eats here a lot. Daniel slowly shook his head. No, it was more than that. He hesitated briefly before adding, and when the waiter brought the reserve wine, he asked Evelyn for approval first. Not me. Not your father. Her. Vanessa immediately looked toward me. You own part of this restaurant too? A small percentage, I answered. Her mouth fell open slightly before snapping shut again. The frustration in her eyes now looked almost desperate. Every new detail seemed to make her feel smaller inside a night that was originally supposed to revolve around her. My mother leaned back heavily in her chair. I do not even know who you are anymore, she whispered softly. I looked at her gently across the candles. I am the same person I have always been. That was the part nobody understood. Money had not changed me. Success had not changed me either. If anything, it made me quieter. More careful. The higher you climb, the more you realize how exhausting performance truly is. Vanessa never learned that lesson because performance was all she understood. So what now? She asked bitterly. Everybody just worships Evelyn because she has money? Nobody is worshipping anyone, Daniel said calmly. People are reacting because we spent 2 hours watching you disrespect someone you clearly never understood. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. Seriously? Her voice cracked slightly now. You are taking her side? Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly before answering. I am taking the side of basic respect. That sentence seemed to hit her harder than anything else all evening. For the first time since dinner started, Vanessa looked genuinely rattled. Not angry. Hurt. Because deep down, she had expected Daniel to protect her no matter what. Instead, he was watching her carefully now with growing uncertainty. The kind that changes relationships permanently. Snow continued drifting past the rooftop windows while soft jazz played somewhere beneath the low conversations around us. A waiter quietly placed the dessert tray nearby, but nobody reached for it. The mood at our table had become too heavy for sweetness. My father cleared his throat awkwardly. Evelyn, he said quietly, why did you keep coming to family dinners if Vanessa treated you like this? I thought about that for a moment. Then I smiled faintly. Because I kept hoping one day she would grow out of it. Vanessa looked away immediately after hearing that. Daniel noticed. So did I. Some truths do not need raised voices to leave damage behind. Sometimes the quietest sentence in the room becomes the one nobody can forget. The check arrived just after 10 o'clock. A black leather folder placed quietly at the center of the table like the final scene in a play nobody expected to end this way. Vanessa reached toward it automatically out of habit, but the waiter gently stopped her. Already taken care of, Miss Carter, he said politely. Vanessa frowned immediately. By who? The waiter looked toward me with a respectful nod. Miss Evelyn handled it earlier this evening. Another silence settled over the table. Smaller this time. Tired. Defeated. Vanessa slowly pulled her hand back while Daniel stared down at the tablecloth without speaking. My mother looked embarrassed now in a way I had never seen before. My father looked thoughtful. Older somehow. Like the entire evening had forced him to reconsider years of assumptions all at once. I stood slowly from my chair and reached for my coat draped across the back of it. "You're leaving?" my mother asked quietly. "It is getting late," I answered. "I have an early meeting tomorrow morning." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh under her breath. "Of course you do." But there was no confidence left in her voice now. Only resentment mixed with humiliation. The dangerous thing about building your identity around superiority is that eventually you meet someone who never needed the competition in the first place. Daniel stood as well. "I will walk you out," he said politely. Vanessa looked stunned. "Seriously?" He glanced at her carefully. "I will be right back." The elevator ride down was quiet except for soft instrumental music playing through hidden speakers overhead. Snow drifted past the glass walls of the building while Chicago glowed silver and gold beneath the night sky. Daniel kept his hands folded in front of him, almost like he was unsure what to say. Finally, he exhaled softly. "I owe you an apology." I looked ahead calmly. "For what?" "For participating in that conversation earlier. I should have stopped it sooner." I gave a small shrug. People usually follow the tone of the room. "Still," he said quietly, "you handled tonight with more grace than most people would have." The elevator doors opened into the lobby where warm golden lights reflected against marble floors polished so perfectly they almost looked wet. My driver had already pulled the car around outside. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." He lowered his voice slightly. "Why did you stay so calm through all of that?" I smiled faintly as we walked toward the entrance together. "Because people reveal themselves eventually when money enters the conversation. I learned that a long time ago." He nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. Outside, the cold December air wrapped around the city while snow gathered along sidewalks and black car roofs. My driver stepped forward to open the back door, but before I got in, Daniel spoke one last time. "For what it is worth," he said carefully, "I do not think you were ever the invisible one in your family." I looked at him for a moment beneath the falling snow. "No," I answered quietly. "I think I was just the only one who never needed attention to feel valuable." He did not respond after that. He simply stood there watching as I slid into the back seat of the car. Through the window, I could still see the rooftop lights glowing high above us against the dark Chicago sky. Somewhere up there, Vanessa was probably still trying to recover control of a night that had slipped completely through her fingers. But some moments cannot be managed once truth enters the room. As the car pulled away from the curb, I rested quietly against the leather seat and watched snow drift across the city I had spent half my life building a future inside. My phone buzzed softly a few seconds later with a message from my mother. "I am sorry we never really saw you." I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone again without replying. Some apologies arrive years too late to change anything. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is finally leave a table where they were never truly respected to begin with.